Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're about ready to begin. We'll start with a big howdy. Howdy. Okay, my name is Shirley DuPriest. I'm a resident of College Station. My husband and I bought our home here in 2007. My husband is an Aggie, graduated with a mechanical engineering degree. I spent 1 year at A&M and then transferred to pharmacy school at another university. But Aggie land is our home now. And genealogy is kind of my second love, my first being my husband. I was attending family reunions that my husband had. His family had actually his mom had for generations, and they originate in Stephenville, which is Central Texas, peanut farming. And the grandkids, and we would be considered grandkids in that family, had asked questions about why we never saw Uncle Doopie's family at the reunion. He was like the oldest of the Keith boys, and nobody could seem to remember. They knew there was some falling out, and nobody talked about it, and it was just nobody would say, and the kids, the younger kids, all were really curious and made up all kinds of stories. So my brother-in-law, who is Keith, stepped into researching genealogy and kind of made some deep dives into family history and came up with this story that explained what had happened. So both families, our two brothers, Uncle Doopie being one, lived out. They were farmers and peanut farmers, and so they lived, kind of down the road from each other, and raised turkeys and had fruit trees and a vegetable garden, and you kind of raised everything that you needed. So one night there was a big row going on outside, and Uncle Doobie's brother's dogs got loose, and they came across and got the turkeys in Uncle Doopie's farm and killed them. And so Uncle Doopie ran out of the house with his shotgun and shot the dog. Well, I think they took the argument to the deacons of the church, and of course the church was like a Keith church. I mean, it was all Keiths. And the families were reluctant to get involved, and it sort of seemed like it had ended balanced. They lost the turkeys, and of course the turkeys would be sold for income during the winter, and the other brother lost his dog, which sort of a member of the family, but they stayed mad for 3 generations, and wouldn't, they just wouldn't come to the family reunion. So at the next reunion, my brother-in-law Larry told the story. And he had coerced a handful of the great-grandkids, to come. And they, of course, had been off the farm and probably didn't even have dogs. And so I think it was resolved that it was okay now for the family to get back together and put that in the past. And that's what genealogy can do. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of history about genealogy, and I'm sure a lot of you have had some exposure. If it's not on television, then it's probably on the internet or Facebook, or just it's everywhere, everywhere you look. But it really is defined as your ancestry, who your ancestors are to begin with. Starts with you and then goes back to your ancestors. There are 5 interesting facts about traditional genealogy. The first is that the spoken traditions that originated were to keep records of family members and their lineage and names and important events. And those tended to be verbal or oral histories. Being able to write and spell and have the tools available, for putting it down on paper weren't terribly available. So spoken traditions were some of the original ways of preserving a pedigree. They also used genealogy records to decide who was going to be the next crown person. So when a ruler was close to death or had already died, and there weren't obvious heirs, or heirs that were inappropriate because they were female or too little or whatever, they relied on some genealogy to go back and see the bigger tree to see if there was someone else in the family that might fill that position. Probably the best dated tree, the family tree, goes back to Confucius, and his reign was back in 551 BC, and it's called the Kong family tree, and it was part and parcel of what became known as Confucianism, and they have, I think Guinness World Records has even agreed that it's the world's longest family tree, which is not necessarily a good thing. It makes it difficult to track. In medieval records, there was not nearly as much about dates, births, marriages, that sort of thing. They were pretty much interested in taxes and lawsuits and land transactions, sort of more like today. Everybody wants to make sure you pay your taxes, you own your property, and lawsuits. But they did use them to back up some legal claims. And then there's wills and tombstones and lots more available nowadays to research and to get information from. Certainly cemeteries and tombstones have interesting information, even tombstones that have Mason symbols or roses or stars, or they have all of those things in the past have had some particular meaning that you can look up and tell, well, what was a mason, or what was a master mason, or what did the single rosebud mean, and so you can get some additional information on tombstones. And I tell you, visiting a tombstone for me is very soothing, and it's interesting because you can see, how long they lived, because they have the birth and the date and their names, and you can kind of guess where maybe their backgrounds were just because of their last name, their surname, and whether their children or have plots next to them, or grandchildren, or it's actually kind of a quiet, soothing place. Okay, so here are 6 fun genealogy facts. Surnames started out based on perhaps your occupancy. So if you were a weaver or a baker, that would be your surname. That when you got to the point where you needed to write it down or identify yourself, and your first name wasn't sufficient, the town got bigger, there were a lot of Bobs, and so you stuck on a last name, and it could be what your occupation was. Sometimes that was based on where you were from. So if there was a loch or a lake or a hill or Brown, and then there are patronymic meanings that are in the language of your location, of your city. If your last name is Andrew, and then your son would be MacAndrew, which I think is a Scottish deal, and Mac means son of in that language. So there were some some bits of that developing surnames. I'm a Gresset, and I have no idea where that would have been pulled from. I haven't managed to track it down prior to coming to the United States, where it became Gresset. So still working on that. Another just general fun fact is that if anybody goes back about 8 generations, most people will have at least 256 ancestors. And that's called outbreeding. So you live in a town, you have big families, there's nobody to date because you know all of them and you're probably related to half of them. So you step out of that community and you go and find somebody further away to breed with or to marry, or, and have children. So that's outbreeding, and that's when your family gets larger and has a lot more ancestry. Charles Habsburg was Charles II of Spain and lived in between 1661 and 1700, and he was so inbred, he only had 29 ancestors. And as a result, he had a lot of physical disabilities. That's just too close to the house. He just needed to, go out a little bit further. But at that time, there was a lot of belief that you kept the line pure and close to home. And now we know that that's probably the worst thing that you can do. Lots of people who have done their family research and found that their name has been changed, blame it on Ellis Island if they came through that location. And there's been some study that has shown that, and I have the reference, I didn't put it on the slide. When you came through, if you couldn't write, then you told the immigration person what your name was and hoped that they spelled it like you said. And and the pronunciation like you used. So there may have been a bit of difference perhaps between if you couldn't write your last name, then there may have been some adjustments. But for the most part, the surname stayed as close to the pronunciation of your ancestor as it could be. There is a lot of excitement in doing your family research. If you go back far enough, there's a chance that William the Conqueror or Charlemagne will be in your family tree, and that's true for actually almost everybody that has an English or European heritage. First of all, they kept track of their family, and if you kind of think about Adam and Eve, it's not a big selection. They don't have a lot of kids. A lot of kids die, so you don't have huge families. And then everybody gets healthier, and it gets bigger and wider. And so we have Charlemagne in our family. Actually, my husband's side does. So I claim that my son can be traced back to Charlemagne, and so does the rest of his relatives. But it's not a huge thing because lots of people who are European have that same ethnicity. There are DNA tests that you can take, and Ancestry.com is one of them, but there are lots of companies out there that will do that. And it's not a detailed list of tests, but it will give you a breakdown of your ancestry. And you have to keep in mind that the way that genetic information is inherited, that my sister and I, if we have the same DNA test and we have the same mother and father, and we do have a little bit of Scandinavian in our heritage, she has quite a bit more than I have, but we're clearly still sisters by the same parents. But the way that the genes kind of get thrown out and put together, she's a little more Scandinavian than I am. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind when you're doing DNA within the family. You don't throw them out because you think, yeah, I don't, just dad got, jiggy with it into somebody else, and it's the way genetics work. There are ship records, immigration records that have a lot of information when people were coming over, and even today when someone comes in by ship, they give the passengers and the age, but they'll also give a bunch of other information about where the ship departed, likely the person that they were with or where they were living before they left. It may also give the information of where they're going to stay and who they're going to stay with whenever they arrive. That was particularly a point made in the military during World War I and World War II, as the military guys got on the ships and went over. They put a lot of detail on connections, so that usually your father was listed as your next of kin or closest of kin, and then where you would be departing and arriving. Of course, some of that was sort of secret, so you can get some extra information on the immigration. Yep. Okay, so reasons why you might consider writing your history, and when I say your family history, I'm really talking about you, not necessarily your parents or your grandparents, but you and your sons and daughters and adopted or inherited, or whatever your current family is. The first thing is that you'll feel so much smarter once you get a handle on your family. They're just, well, first of all, you have to learn how to use the internet a little bit better than probably you do now to find most of the information. So at the very least, you'll be a little bit more comfortable using the computer. And there's some statistics that they've done studies on that show that like the 72% helps them to be closer to their relatives. Well, so the Keith family now understands why there was a squabble. They can appreciate what it was at the time and why it meant something then, but now they know that story, and now it's a funny story. Yeah, because we talk about the turkeys and the dogs at every reunion. And then there's always about a 50-50 chance that you will discover ancestors that you didn't know that you had. So it was not uncommon at all 3 generations ago for husbands to go through more than one wife, wives that died in childbirth primarily, but because of illnesses as well. So it was likely that there were stepchildren and half-brothers, and that you may not have had a lot of contact with, that as you've grown up, those bonds are not as close, and you've moved further away, and you just may be surprised about all those family that you didn't know that you had. The next thing is that first-person narratives and family histories are actually important historical documents. You leave a legacy, and it doesn't matter if it's small or large. You just don't know what that might mean down the road. Interesting stories that you find out become familiar with you, and you can pass them along to your family and friends. And you are an important person, and you have things to pass on, not to just your children, but to your local history society. Our history society is always looking for oral history information and stories about families that have grown up here, And then you never know what the future generation is going to want to be interested in, or, how did we get where we are in 20 years, or what were my parents thinking when they used plastic for everything, or, there's some future generations that may be able to use some of this information. You and your family are important to somebody, and maybe several somebodies. So if you think about things that you do every day without giving it a lot of thought, all those families on the Mayflower were probably just lucky if they got there without drowning. And then they produced more than 20 million descendants. So, that's an important somebody. The family trees are pretty abstract, as you can see from the papers that I passed out. It's sort of a name, address, phone number, forms you fill out all the time. But anytime you can add a story to that, you're going to add a lot of depth, and it sticks better. And don't forget that every time the doctor asks you if you have a family history of cancer or stroke or heart disease, that's part of your ancestry as well. And so you're already sharing some of that with your doctor, and as gruesome as it is, it's probably wise to know some of that and kind of just be aware. I know from firsthand that memories over time become fragmented and a little fuzzy and distorted for sure. So if you go ahead and write it down now, while it's clear, and while you remember what your grandparents used to tell you, and where they came from, and what you had for breakfast this morning, or however much information you want to keep down, it's worth having. Also, if you write your family history, you can make it sound any way you want to. So I personally believe my side of the family is connected to William the Conqueror. My husband's side of the family goes back to Charlemagne, so there, I beat that. Not just the big things, but the little things. If you feel like you've got a relative that's been slighted, that nobody knew just how rough their life was, and it's an opportunity for you to kind of sort that out and maybe put in some information that gives them a boost. There is a need for history, for diverse family histories. So, if you were to look in a library at history books, they're a lot like us. It's a lot of white people writing all that history, and a lot of white people that were involved in all that history. But there are also a lot of diversity that we don't have books about, or just stories. So if you have a Lutheran background, if you are Huguenot background, if you are a Protestant, and not just religious diversity, but racial diversity as well. I mean, if you're a Scot, well, that's pretty diverse, but you could probably write some good stories about your family being Scottish. There also needs to be more history about female lines, where we've kind of been overshadowed by the male lines, but there's certainly women that were responsible for keeping their family going for maybe the whole time. My mother was certainly one of them. And we need family histories by people that weren't rich. Okay, the Rockefellers, could do everything, but Mr. and Miss Smith, who just raised their family and went to church and kept their yard clean, they probably got some stories too that made a difference. And it'd be interesting to keep that out there, so that we get a variety of histories. There's questions that tend to be raised whenever you're doing some genealogy research. It's up to you personally to decide whether you keep those to yourself when you think you should, or maybe not. Maybe it should be some information that ought to be out there for the rest of the family. You get to decide that if it's your story that you're writing. So the one about understanding your current family dynamics, that would be the turkey and dog story that kind of clarified how our family reunions were attended. If you get started on this, there's lots of evidence out there. And it just takes a little bit of research, and I hate to use that word because it's really not even research. You go to Google and you just type in your name, and it's going to give you a bunch of stuff. And then if you type in your name and genealogy, then it's going to give you a bunch of stuff. Most of those require a fee. However, most of them will let you do either a week free before you have to start paying, or some of them will give you a month free. And I can guarantee you that in a month or even a week, you can get more information than you know what to do with. But all of those have great reputations and will walk you through the steps very easily. It's not complicated at all. It's handy if you have a printer that you can print off the information, but writing it down works as well. And always, no matter whether you think it's going to be something that you keep, I would still note where you found the information. Because who knows, you could come across some amazing story and somebody saved some battle, and you want to be able to say, here's where it came from. Here's where I found that information. So if it's a census record, if it's in a book, if it's on one of these websites, just make a note of that. If you print this stuff out off on a printer, it'll almost always give you the source on the page that you're copying. Records at home that you have, the family Bible that hopefully your grandparents listed when the kids were born, or when they got married, or when they died. That may be an option. Find a grave is really good, and just going through a local cemetery where you think your parents or grandparents are buried. They have the dates, birth and death dates on all the headstones. County records have birth certificates, death certificates, and adoption records. I don't know about baptismal records. You probably have to get those from the church if you know the church that your family grew up in. Like I said, the county courthouse has mostly digitized here in College Station records, land records in particular, but tax records, mechanics liens. Those are all digitized. You can do those all in their facility on their laptops. Doesn't cost you anything unless you print it off. And if you just take a picture of the screen with your camera, you don't have to print it off. So all of the courthouse records are there, and they're not difficult to search either. And there are people there that will walk you through how to use them. Newspapers.com requires a fee, but again, I believe you can get a free month for signing up. Newspapers have lots of information, and in the earlier days, if you were in a small community, the newspapers would have columns about your little neighborhood and put, Mr. and Mrs. and all their kids came to visit their grandparents for her birthday, and just look.
Tell me about newspapers.com. I'm
Yep.
not familiar with that. Is that pretty broad?
It is. Yep.
The small cities and.
Yep. It's amazing. Yeah.
There's another one too, Chronicling America.
Oh.
National Archives.
Oh, okay.
And it covers different newspapers.
Oh, okay, all right, so that's, yeah,
What was that?
Chronicling.
Chronicling America, and Portal of Texas History also has newspapers.
Okay, so you, yeah, and of course, you can get newspaper articles about, you know, if you're not interested in people, you just want to know about World War I, you know, you can get front page news for the whole time that was going on, and if you're just a history buff in general. But so when I've done research for the Historic Preservation Committee for several historic markers for houses out in Southside, and so I'm looking for people I don't know, but when they lived here and what they may have been doing while they were here, and most of that is from the local newspaper, because it was a small community and the paper put everything in it. I mean, they were looking for information, so that's a really good resource. Marriage license and divorce decrees, I think those are city secretary. Well, I'm not sure where those are found. You should have your own at the house. But I'll have to check if there's, there is a website that you can order. If you're a family member, you can order a marriage and death certificate and divorce certificate online. There are census records that start in that's supposed to be 1870. And yes, you're right, 1790. And then the 1950 records just came out. And that is so cool to go through, because you can see who lived next door to your parents. And if you were little before 1950, then your name's in there, and you can see, you know, maybe remember the kids you played with on that street and how long you lived there, and probably where they worked and how old they were when they got married, and lots of information. Military records are available on Ancestry.com, and there are free sites if you just Google military histories, and then you just get, I mean, there's tons of information about the military. So I think that this information is on one of the sheets that I gave you under the research checklist. It lists all of the different bits of information that are out there. And then the family unit history is to just give you an idea of the basic information to start with. And it's all your information. It's not your grandparents. It's not your in-laws. It's husband, wife, brothers and sisters, and then children. So that right there, for most of us, is a full page of information, and then you go from there. So this is why I began. The woman on the far left is my father's great-grandmother. The middle woman is my grandmother and my father's mother, and this is my father. He died when he was 30, so we didn't get a lot of time with him. So I was in the 4th grade, so I was 10 when he died. And I can remember all of the trips that we made home to visit the Gressets. His last name was Gresset. And they were our big family. There were 15 of his brothers and sisters, and then all of them had 3 or 4 kids. And they got together religiously. So Easters, Christmases, birthdays, anniversaries, we drove over to Mississippi. It's where they lived, and and the kids just. But we did that for the first 10 years of my life. After my dad died, we went for maybe 2 more years. Mom remarried, and that really slowed down because we had another family to visit now. And we made it back over occasionally. I went and took my son to meet his great-grandmother when he was born, and she was still alive. She lived until she was 99, so I did get to see her again. But that kind of tugged at my heartstrings, and I thought, you know, I have cousins. I have a lot of cousins, and my son has got a ton of second cousins that he doesn't know about or doesn't remember. So that was why I decided to do my own genealogy research. It's been incredible. It's a hobby, thank goodness, because if I were working full-time, I don't know how I would, you know, be able to do all that I wanted to do. I have joined the DAR. My brother-in-law is in the SAR. My husband's family has joined the Huguenot Society. So we have history that is beyond just our immediate family. And when my brother-in-law passed away last year, I inherited his family's genealogy records and his stack of references, and they're just incredible. I think that how you approach the information is up to you. It can be just your immediate family, it can be just a little bit, but I tell you, once you start getting stories, and because all of us come from probably a big family, if you reach out just to second cousins, maybe as far as second cousins, somebody out there is going to have a good story, and you may not be very familiar with that second cousin, but I tell you what, you'll hang on to that story and tell it next time somebody asks. So the stories are the fun part, and I think my new project, or my next project, is going to be trying to get my dad's side of the families down into a legible, easily handled, monstrous book that I can take to the next family reunion. So what now for you is fill out those forms and get started. That's it.